Since he died last night around 8:30, or at least that's when the news came out, all the focus has been on Charles Manson. We want to flip it for a moment and put the attention back where it belongs on his victims who were murdered on August 9th, 1969. And the first man to fall was a Detroit native, a man who had found fame in Hollywood as a hairdresser. And his nephew has been good enough to reach out to us, and he's at the other end of our line. Anthony DiMaria, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Hi, Guy.
What does his death mean to your family, especially your mother?
Well, with regard to Mr. Manson's death, it really has very little in terms of any kind of, comfort or closure with regards to the crimes and obviously Jay's death. But our thoughts and our hearts are where they have been for nearly 48 years now, and that's with the 10 people who have been lying in their graves for that amount of time. And, so our thoughts are really just about who the victims were, what they were, how they were living, and where they were headed, and, of course, what they suffered in the last moments of their lives. So it's less about Charles Manson, and it's really about justice for their crimes, and that includes all the killers, not just Mr. Manson, but all the people who had a hand in the murder rampage. And
well, we should point out too that your uncle died in defense of Sharon Tate that night, who was being manhandled, though she was 8.5 months pregnant, and he spoke up and paid for it with his life.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think, sadly, there's very little that people really know with regards to these crimes, and outside of exploitation and sensationalism, because I think that the murders were eventually they were treated as a form of narrative and entertainment eventually over the years. Mm-hmm. But and what you had described is probably not really regarded much, but I think that also it's the very least in terms of what Jay actually did. And it took me many years to speak with the authorities at the LABA's office and also LAPD and referencing the testimony. And that's from the words of Charles Watson and Susan Atkins themselves. And what had happened was that Jay actually, there was two women with hunting knives, and Charles Watson had a bayonet and a gun. And at a certain point, I think that Jay had realized that it was not going to end well. And at one point in the testimony of both Watson and Atkins, it's revealed that Jay, when Watson had his back turned for a moment, Jay charged him, and Susan Atkins yelled out, "Watch out!" And that's as Jay was lunging towards Watson, and he turned and shot Jay through his armpit while he was throwing a punch, and that's when the other individuals pounced on his back. So I think that it's always been very curious to our family that no one really knows about that. I mean, including that's in Vincent Bugliosi's book. I've always wondered, why don't we know more about that? And why don't we know more about Jay and what he was achieving, but more about these people who committed these crimes? And that's something that has been, that it's actually, the more I've learned is over the years, is that there appears to be a big chasm between a man who lived and a man who was portrayed after death.
Right. When the state of California struck down the death penalty, I know that a burden shifted really to your mom and to your family to make sure that these heinous individuals stayed behind bars. And you carried that burden admirably.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I know my mother would appreciate hearing that. But,
how many times did she have to go before the parole board, or did she at least write and plead the case on behalf of your uncle?
Well, my mother and I, my sisters, my father, and Jay's brother, Fred, my uncle, Fred, we've all written and attended, well, my family, my mother and family in Vegas, we've actually attended roughly I would say, nearing 20 parole hearings.
Good heavens.
And when my mother had called me when I was living in New York, and when she heard a news interview that was saying that maybe the victim or the murderers might actually be paroled, because my parents and grandparents were guaranteed by the LADA's office and LAPD, or the LA District Attorney's office, that actual parole for any of these people was really it was not a real possibility. But then sometime in the 90s, it did become an actual possibility. And that's when my mother, and she asked that I contact Stephen Kay, the district attorney. And we were told that, yes, it was a fight. And so that's why we began getting involved in these parole hearings. And there were so many people involved that sometimes we'll go to 2 to 5 parole hearings in 1 year.
I'm not sure, and we should point out to our listeners that Jay Sebring is buried right here in Southfield in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. And do you hear often, Anthony DiMaria, that you look a lot like him?
Yes, I actually do, and that really it makes me feel great, because he was a sharp man. And I was very young when he was killed, but he just had a presence and a charisma that really left an indelible impression on me. And I think that anyone that really knew Jay would share that. And so that's why I'm speaking with you today. It has nothing to do with the passing of Mr. Manson. It had to do with telling people who Jay was. And I think that pretty soon, I've been doing a documentary on his life because of the impact he had on our family, sure, but also culturally and historically in Hollywood and in men's hair design. And I think that taking into account all this kind of misinformation, I became compelled to actually tell his story. And I think that that's why I'm talking with you right now.
Well, I have to take a short break. Can you stay with us just for a couple more minutes, because I want to learn more about his legacy in Hollywood?
Sure.
All right. We'll continue this conversation with Anthony DiMaria, the nephew of Jay Sebring, one of the Manson family victims, but much, much more than that. We'll be back. Right now, sunny skies, 46 degrees. He went to Highland Park, St. Benedict School, and went on to become the hairdresser to the stars out in Hollywood, much more than just the murder victim of the most infamous mass murder on the West Coast. Anthony DiMaria is Jay Sebring's nephew, and I just want to give you a chance to talk about his contributions to the look of the 1960s.
Yeah, there's no way you can overstate that fact. It's kind of hard to describe what he achieved and what he originated. And in an interview with Vito Sassoon for his life story, Mr. Sassoon, he told me that he felt that Jay did for men's hair design, as Jay referred to it, not men's hair styling, but that he did for men what Vidal did for women. And I think that that's a great compliment, but I think in a way it's not quite as accurate. And that is that before Jay Sebring, men went to barbers. I mean, and they essentially walked in and picked a cut off a barber chart, and it was literally placed on your head, whether it be a part on the left or right. But so what Jay did is he created men's hair design or men's hair styling. He literally created that. And I think in doing that, he was single-handedly responsible for the iconic looks of pretty much every Hollywood recording and film artist during the 60s. And it started with the Rat Pack, and he was a personal stylist to everyone in the Rat Pack with the exception of Dean Martin. And then he was hired by Stanley Kubrick to design the look for Kirk Douglas in Spartacus. And
Anthony, I hate to do this to you, but they're cutting me off. I'm out of time here, but some great looks. Steve McQueen, Paul Newman, James Garner. Thank you for sharing your uncle with us this afternoon. We appreciate it. And best to your mom.